The winter of 1978 would go down in history as one of America's most brutal. Blizzards buried entire towns, temperatures plunged to bone-shattering lows, and even the most prepared families struggled to survive. But for Raymond Blackwell, a 75-year-old man with calloused hands and a lifetime of hard-earned knowledge, that winter became something else entirely. It became a test of everything he'd ever learned about survival, dignity, and the raw power of human will. Raymond had spent 52 years married to the same woman, living in the same farmhouse in rural Michigan, working the same land his father had worked before him. But on a gray November morning, everything changed. His wife, Martha, stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and her jaw set firm. The words came out cold and final. "You need to leave, Raymond. Today." No explanation that made sense. No room for discussion. Just decades of buried resentments finally erupting like a long dormant volcano. By noon, Raymond was standing at the end of the driveway with nothing but a worn canvas rucksack, a hunting knife his grandfather had given him, and the clothes on his back. If you're finding this story as gripping as we intended, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We bring you real stories of survival, resilience, and the incredible things ordinary people accomplish when pushed to their absolute limits. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss what happens next in Raymond's journey. The following story is presented as a narrative reconstruction. Most men at 75 would have walked into town, called a relative, found a shelter. But Raymond wasn't most men. He'd grown up during the Depression, learned to trap rabbits at age 6, built his first cabin at 14 with nothing but an axe and determination. Technology had passed him by like water around a stone. He'd never owned a cell phone, barely watched television, and treated modern conveniences with the suspicion of a man who knew they could fail you when you needed them most. So instead of heading toward the small town of Millbrook 5 miles east, Raymond turned west, toward the forest, toward the vast stretch of wilderness that bordered the old Blackwell property. Land he'd hunted and explored since he was a boy. The first night, he slept under a massive pine tree, using his rucksack as a pillow and covering himself with fallen branches. The temperature dropped to 28 degrees. His joints ached. His breath formed clouds in the darkness. But Raymond had endured worse. What gnawed at him more than the cold was the hollow feeling in his chest, the sense of being erased from his own life. But as dawn broke through the trees and frost glittered on every surface, something shifted inside him. If Martha wanted him gone, he'd be gone. But he'd be gone on his own terms. Raymond knew these woods held something most people would never notice, a massive hollow oak tree about 3 miles deeper into the forest. He'd discovered it decades ago while tracking a wounded deer. The oak was ancient, easily 12 feet in diameter, with a hollow interior large enough to stand in. Lightning had split it years ago, carving out the center, while somehow leaving the outer shell alive and standing. Most people would have seen a dead tree. Raymond saw possibility. It took him most of that second day to reach it, his old legs protesting every step, his lungs burning in the cold air. But when he finally stood before the hollow oak again, he felt something he hadn't felt since Martha's words had cut him loose from his moorings. Purpose. The opening was roughly 4 feet wide and 7 feet tall, facing south, away from the prevailing winds. Inside, the hollow extended upward about 15 feet, with enough floor space for a man to lie down. The wood was solid despite the hollow core, seasoned by time and weather into something harder than iron. Raymond dropped his rucksack and got to work. No plans, no blueprints, just the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime spent working with his hands. First priority, insulation. He spent the remaining daylight hours gathering armfuls of dry leaves, pine needles, and moss from the surrounding forest floor. He packed them into the gaps and cracks in the oak's interior, creating a barrier between himself and the wind that would soon howl through these woods with murderous intent. His fingers were numb by the time darkness fell, but he'd created a 6-inch layer of natural insulation around the entire interior. That night, curled inside his hollow tree with the entrance partially blocked by branches, Raymond felt the temperature plummet. But inside his oak shelter, surrounded by his insulation, the temperature held at a bearable 42 degrees. It wasn't comfort, but it was survival. And survival, Raymond had learned long ago, was often enough. The next morning brought the first real test. Raymond woke to find 2 inches of snow covering the ground and more falling steadily from a slate-gray sky. Weather reports would later confirm what locals already suspected. An early winter was coming and it would be savage. But Raymond had no radio, no weather reports, only his instincts and the behavior of the animals around him. The squirrels had been frantic for weeks, gathering food with unusual urgency. The deer were already moving to lower ground. Nature was screaming warnings that humans, in their heated homes, were ignoring. Raymond's second priority was fire, but not just any fire. An open flame inside a hollow tree was suicide, but he needed heat and a way to cook. Using his hunting knife, he began the painstaking process of carving a small fire pit about 10 feet from the oak's entrance. He dug down through the snow and frozen topsoil until he hit mineral earth that wouldn't burn. Then he gathered rocks, flat pieces of shale from a nearby creek bed, and arranged them in a circle. Above this, he constructed a simple chimney using more flat rocks, angling it to draw smoke away from his shelter. The work took 3 days. His hands bled from scraping against stone and frozen earth. His back screamed with every movement. But on the evening of the 3rd day, Raymond struck sparks from his knife against a piece of flint he'd found and coaxed those sparks into a tiny flame among a nest of dry bark shavings. Within an hour, he had a proper fire burning, and for the first time since Martha had cast him out, Raymond felt something close to satisfaction. He'd created warmth from nothing. He'd bent the wilderness to his will, just slightly, just enough. Now came the matter of food. Raymond's rucksack had contained only a half loaf of bread and a small chunk of cheese, both long gone. He'd need to hunt, but 75-year-old reflexes weren't what they used to be, and he had no gun, no bow. What he did have was knowledge. He spent the next 2 days constructing snares from thin branches and cordage he made by stripping the inner bark from young basswood trees. The process was meditative, ancient, the kind of skill that lived in his hands more than his mind. He set 12 snares along rabbit runs he identified by tracks and droppings. The first morning, he caught nothing. The second morning, one snare held a young cottontail, already frozen, but fresh. Raymond whispered a thank you to the rabbit and to the forest that provided it. He wasn't religious in any formal sense, but he believed in gratitude, in recognizing that survival meant other things had to die. He skinned the rabbit with efficient movements learned 60 years ago, saved the pelt, and roasted the meat over his fire. It was tough and gamey, but it was protein, calories, life. As November became December, Raymond fell into a rhythm. Wake before dawn, check snares, gather firewood, reinforce his shelter, improve his camp. He carved wooden stakes and drove them into the ground inside the oak, creating crude shelves where he could store his growing collection of useful items. Carved bowls, cordage, dried meat, medicinal plants he recognized from his youth. He found a way to collect water by hanging a piece of bark beneath a snow-covered branch positioned to catch melt during the brief warmth of midday. Every improvement was incremental, born from necessity and implemented with the tools at hand. He had no nails, so he learned to use wooden pegs and notches. He had no saw, so he learned to split wood using wedges he carved from hardwood and struck with rocks. His knife, that precious blade of carbon steel, became an extension of his will, used for everything from cleaning game to carving tools to scraping hides. The neighbors back at the farm, if they thought of Raymond at all, probably assumed he'd gone to stay with his sister in Ohio or checked into some retirement home. Martha certainly wasn't telling anyone different. But Raymond was 7 miles deep in wilderness by now, completely invisible to the world that had rejected him, and as the first major blizzard of that historic winter began to gather strength over the Great Lakes, Raymond Blackwell was as prepared as any man could be who was living inside a tree with nothing but a knife and his wits. December 20th brought the storm that weather services would later call unprecedented. The snow began falling on a Tuesday morning and didn't stop for 63 hours. Winds reached 70 miles per hour, creating whiteout conditions and drifts that buried entire houses. The temperature dropped to 18 degrees below zero, and with wind chill, felt like 40 below. 11 people died in Michigan alone during that storm. Thousands were trapped in their homes even with modern heating and electricity. Raymond saw it coming the day before it hit. The birds vanished. The air pressure changed in a way he felt in his bones and his old war wound. He spent that entire day gathering every scrap of firewood he could find, stacking it inside and around the oak until he had enough to last a week if he was careful. He lined the entrance of his shelter with a woven mat of pine boughs, creating a door of sorts that could block wind while still allowing some airflow. Then he settled in to wait. When the storm hit, it hit like the fist of an angry god. The wind howled through the forest with a sound like tortured souls, and snow fell so thick Raymond couldn't see 5 feet beyond his oak. The temperature inside his shelter dropped despite his best efforts, hovering around 32 degrees, right at freezing. He kept his fire burning low and constant, rationing his wood, and wrapped himself in the 3 rabbit pelts he'd managed to cure, and the deer hide he'd found from an old kill and scraped clean. For 3 days, Raymond barely moved. He dozed, woke, fed small sticks to his fire, dozed again. His world contracted to the hollow space inside that oak, the flicker of firelight on ancient wood, the sound of wind trying to claw its way inside. His thoughts drifted to Martha, to the farm, to the life that seemed more like a dream now than something he'd actually lived. But mostly he thought about nothing at all, entering a state of half-hibernation that his body remembered from countless hunting trips, from Korea in the winter of '51, from a lifetime of understanding that sometimes survival meant becoming still. When the storm finally broke on the 4th day, Raymond emerged from his hollow oak into a world transformed beyond recognition. The forest had become a cathedral of white silence. Snow lay in drifts up to 6 feet deep in places, sculpted by the wind into smooth, surreal formations that looked more like ocean waves frozen in time. Every branch, every trunk, every surface wore a thick coat of ice and snow. The sky was a pale, cloudless blue, and the air was so cold it felt like inhaling shards of glass. Raymond stood there for a long moment, his breath forming thick clouds, taking stock. He was alive. His shelter had held. His fire had survived. These were victories that mattered more than any medal he'd earned in the war, more than any harvest he'd brought in from the farm. He'd faced down nature's fury with nothing but knowledge and determination, and he'd won. But the war wasn't over. It had only just begun. The storm had buried his snares completely. It would take days to dig them out and reset them, and in the meantime, he had no source of food except the small amount of dried rabbit meat he'd been saving. His firewood supply, so carefully gathered, was now half what it had been. And more concerning, the entrance to his oak had partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow and ice. He'd need to clear it and reinforce it before the next storm came, and his bones told him another was coming soon. If you're still watching, fascinated by how Raymond is managing to survive conditions that would kill most people in hours, do us a favor. Drop a comment below telling us what you think of his resourcefulness. Have you ever had to survive in difficult conditions? What's the most challenging situation you've ever faced? We read every single comment, and your stories inspire the content we create. So take a moment, share your thoughts, and let's build a community of people who appreciate true grit and survival. Raymond spent that entire day digging, not frantically, not desperately, but with the methodical patience of a man who understood that wasted energy in these conditions meant death. He used a flat piece of bark as a makeshift shovel, clearing snow from around his shelter's entrance, from his fire pit, from the paths he'd worn to his snare locations. His 75-year-old body protested every movement. His lower back seized up twice, forcing him to stop and stretch until the spasm passed. His fingers, even wrapped in strips of rabbit fur, went numb repeatedly. But by nightfall, he'd cleared enough space to move freely around his immediate camp. He'd also made a crucial discovery while digging, a fallen birch tree, buried under 3 feet of snow but still relatively fresh. Birch bark was waterproof, flexible, and invaluable for a dozen different purposes. Raymond spent the last light of day carefully peeling large sections of bark from the fallen tree, rolling them up, and carrying them back to his oak. Tomorrow, he'd put them to use. That night, with temperatures dropping to 22 below zero. Raymond implemented a technique he'd learned from an old trapper when he was just a boy. He heated rocks in his fire until they were almost too hot to touch, then wrapped them carefully in strips of birch bark and placed them inside his shelter near where he slept. The rocks would radiate heat for hours, creating a microclimate inside the oak that could mean the difference between sleep and hypothermia. It worked. Raymond slept for 8 straight hours, the longest continuous sleep he'd had since leaving the farm. Morning brought a new challenge and a new opportunity. The challenge was that his water collection system had frozen solid, the bark container now just a useless ice sculpture. The opportunity came in the form of tracks he spotted at first light. Deer tracks, fresh, multiple animals, heading toward a stand of young aspens about half a mile north. Deer meant food, potentially enough food to last weeks if he could bring one down. But how do you kill a deer with nothing but a knife? The answer was, you don't. Not directly. But Raymond had other options. He spent the morning constructing what old-timers called a deadfall trap, a device so simple and so deadly that humans had been using variations of it for 10,000 years. He found a natural deer path, clear even under the snow from the way the vegetation grew, and identified a spot where the path narrowed between 2 large trees. Here, he began construction. First, he cut and dragged a heavy log, easily 200 pounds, positioning it on a framework of sticks arranged like a figure-4 trigger. The engineering was elegant in its simplicity. A vertical stick, a diagonal stick, and a horizontal bait stick, all notched to hold each other in place under the weight of the suspended log. When an animal disturbed the bait stick, the entire structure would collapse, and the log would fall with lethal force. Raymond had built dozens of these as a young man, catching everything from raccoons to black bears. But he'd never built one when his life depended on it succeeding. The bait was the tricky part. Deer in winter were desperate for certain nutrients, particularly salt. Raymond had saved his own urine in a carved wooden bowl for this exact purpose. The salt and minerals concentrated enough to attract deer from considerable distances. He poured it over a bundle of dried grass tied to the bait stick, then carefully set the trigger mechanism. The log hung suspended, ready to drop with crushing force the moment anything disturbed that bait. Then Raymond retreated to watch and wait. Hunting in his youth had taught Raymond patience, but hunting at 75 required a different kind of endurance. He couldn't simply sit in the cold for hours. His old body would shut down. So he developed a pattern. Check the trap at dawn, noon, and dusk, spending the time between back at camp maintaining his fire, improving his shelter, working on the dozen small projects that kept him alive. He used the birch bark he'd harvested to create a better door for his oak, overlapping sheets and securing them with wooden pegs to create a flexible barrier that blocked wind but could be easily moved. 3 days passed. The trap remained unsprung. Raymond's food supply dwindled to almost nothing. He managed to catch one more rabbit in his snares, but it was small, barely a meal. His body was starting to consume itself, that hollow feeling in his stomach becoming a constant companion. He'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, his already lean frame growing gaunt. But he'd been hungry before. Korea had taught him that a man could function on remarkably little food if he had to. On the 4th morning, everything changed. Raymond approached the deadfall trap at dawn to find it sprung, the heavy log lying on the ground, and beneath it, a young doe, dead, her neck broken cleanly. Raymond's hands shook as he knelt beside her, not from the cold, but from pure relief and gratitude. This animal represented life, weeks of life, maybe enough to get him through to spring. He placed his hand on her still warm flank and spoke softly. "Thank you, sister. Your death gives me life. I won't waste any part of you." The butchering process was brutal work in the cold. Raymond had to move fast before the meat froze solid, but careful enough not to waste anything or contaminate the meat. He field dressed the deer right there, saving the organs he could eat: heart, liver, kidneys, and burying the rest to keep scavengers from becoming a problem near his camp. Then came the hard part, moving a 120-pound carcass half a mile through deep snow. Raymond couldn't drag it. The snow was too deep and his strength too limited. Instead, he improvised a sled from birch bark and saplings, creating a flexible platform he could load the deer onto and pull behind him. It still took him 4 hours to get the carcass back to camp, stopping every 100 yards to rest, his heart hammering in his chest, his vision occasionally graying at the edges. But he made it. By early afternoon, he had the deer hanging from a branch near his oak, beginning the process of skinning and butchering. His knife, already dull from weeks of constant use, needed sharpening. Raymond spent an hour working it against a flat river stone, the rhythmic scraping almost meditative until the edge was keen enough to shave hair from his arm. Then he set to work on the deer hide, carefully removing it in one piece. Properly tanned, that hide would become a blanket, clothes, cordage, a dozen different useful items. But tanning required time and materials he didn't have, so he opted for a faster, cruder method, brain tanning. Every animal carries enough brain tissue to tan its own hide, a fact that seemed almost providential to Raymond. He'd saved the deer's brain, and now he mashed it into a paste, working it thoroughly into the flesh side of the hide. The lipids in the brain would break down the proteins in the hide, making it soft and supple. It was messy, smelly work, his hands covered in brain matter and blood, but it was necessary work. He stretched the hide between 4 stakes driven into the ground near his fire, where the smoke would help preserve it while the brain solution did its work. The meat required different handling. In temperatures this cold, freezing was inevitable, and actually helpful for preservation. Raymond cut the deer into manageable portions, roasts, steaks, ribs, and stew meat. He hung most of it from high branches, wrapped in birch bark to protect it from birds, where it would freeze solid and keep for months. But he kept a substantial portion near his fire for immediate use, smoking it slowly over green wood to create jerky that would last even if temperatures rose. That night, Raymond ate like a king. He roasted the deer's heart over his fire, the meat tender and rich, and followed it with chunks of backstrap cooked to perfection. The fat from the deer, rendered down, he saved carefully in a birch bark container. Fat was liquid gold in winter, providing concentrated calories and useful for everything from cooking to waterproofing to emergency fire starter. His belly full for the first time in weeks, Raymond slept deeply, his body finally getting the nutrients it desperately needed to repair and sustain itself. The deer changed everything. With food secured, Raymond could focus on improvements rather than just survival. He used the deer's sinew to create strong cordage, far superior to the plant fibers he'd been using. He fashioned needles from bone splinters, polishing them against stone until they were smooth and sharp. With these tools he could sew, creating a crude but effective winter coat from the deer hide once it finished tanning. Every part of the animal found a purpose. Bones became tools. The stomach became a water container. Even the hooves were boiled down for glue. December gave way to January, and the winter that meteorologists were calling historic showed no signs of relenting. Storm after storm pounded Michigan, each one bringing fresh snow and temperatures that regularly dropped below zero. In Millbrook, the small town Raymond had left behind, people huddled in their homes, burning through heating oil at unprecedented rates, straining an electrical grid that kept threatening to fail. 15 more people died across the state from the cold, mostly elderly folks whose heating failed or who slipped on ice and couldn't get help in time. But 7 miles away in the wilderness, inside a hollow oak tree, a 75-year-old man was not just surviving, but adapting. Raymond's camp had evolved from a desperate shelter into something approaching a functional homestead. He'd constructed a smoking rack that allowed him to preserve meat continuously. He'd dug a cold storage pit, essentially a hole in the permafrost, where he could keep food items that benefited from cool but not frozen temperatures. He'd even created a primitive calendar, notching a stick each day so he could track time's passage. His daily routine had become almost ritual. Wake before dawn, feed the fire, check and reset snares, work on whatever improvement project was most pressing, hunt or gather, prepare food, work on clothing or tools, sleep. Every action was deliberate, every movement calculated to conserve energy while accomplishing necessary tasks. There was no wasted motion, no frivolous activity. Life had been stripped down to its absolute essentials, and Raymond found a strange peace in that simplicity. The loneliness, though, that was harder to manage. Raymond had never been a particularly social man, comfortable with silence and his own company, but human beings weren't meant for this kind of isolation. Some days he'd catch himself talking out loud, narrating his actions or arguing with himself about the best way to accomplish a task. Other days he'd remember conversations from 40 years ago with perfect clarity, replaying them in his mind like favorite songs. He thought about Martha less as time went on, the anger and hurt fading into something more like bewilderment. How had 52 years led to that gray November morning? What had he missed? What signs had he failed to read? But mostly he thought about his father, dead now 20 years, who'd taught Raymond everything about living off the land. The old man had been a hard teacher, quick with criticism and stingy with praise, but everything he'd taught had been true and useful. A man who knows how to work with his hands, his father had said 1,000 times, can survive anything this world throws at him. Raymond wished he could show the old man this camp, this impossible survival. He wished he could say, "Look, Pa, you were right. It was all worth learning." By late January, Raymond had been living in the wilderness for 3 months, and the man who'd been kicked out of his farmhouse barely resembled the man who now moved through the winter forest with quiet efficiency. He'd lost nearly 30 pounds, his body burning fat and then muscle to fuel itself. But what remained was wire-tough and resilient. His beard had grown long and wild, frosted white with ice most mornings. His hands, already calloused from a lifetime of work, had become something else entirely. Thick, scarred, practically immune to cold and pain. The historic winter continued its assault. February brought temperatures that shattered records across Michigan, with several consecutive days never rising above 10 below zero. The snow depth in Raymond's area measured over 4 feet on level ground, with drifts twice that height. Every weather report spoke of crisis. Roads impassable, supplies running low, small towns completely cut off. National Guard units were deployed to deliver food and heating oil to stranded communities. Raymond knew none of this. His world had contracted to a few square miles of forest, his hollow oak, and the daily challenge of staying alive. He'd long since stopped thinking about rescue or return. This was his life now, and he'd made his peace with it. The forest had become home in a way the farmhouse never quite had. Here everything made sense. Work produced results. Skill mattered. There were no buried resentments, no words left unsaid for decades, no slow accumulation of disappointments. Just the clean simplicity of effort and outcome. His clothing had evolved into something a frontiersman from 2 centuries ago would recognize. The deer hide, properly brain-tanned and smoked, had become a long coat that hung to his knees, cinched with a belt made from twisted sinew. He'd fashioned crude boots by wrapping his worn shoes in rabbit fur and deer hide, securing them with more sinew. Mittens made from rabbit pelts kept his hands functional. He looked like something from another time, a ghost of America's wilderness past wandering through the present. The second major test came in mid-February when Raymond woke one morning to find his fire had died completely during the night. The cold had been so intense that even his carefully banked coals had surrendered. Without fire, in temperatures approaching 20 below, he had perhaps hours before hypothermia became irreversible. His emergency flint and steel were there, his bark tinder prepared, but his hands were so cold they barely functioned, fumbling the steel twice before he could grip it properly. It took him 45 minutes of striking sparks, his fingers screaming with pain, before a tiny ember caught in his tinder bundle. He nursed it like a newborn, breathing gently, adding the finest shavings of birch bark, building heat molecule by molecule until finally, miraculously, a flame appeared. Within an hour, he had a proper fire going again, but those 45 minutes had aged him. He'd seen how close the edge was, how quickly everything could end. After that, Raymond never let his fire die completely. He developed a system of rotating logs that could burn slowly for 12 hours, and he woke twice each night to feed it, setting his internal clock with the precision of decades of farm work. Sleep became fragmented but functional, and the fire became the heartbeat of his existence, the one constant in a world of variables. March arrived with no hint of spring. The winter that had already broken every record showed no sign of releasing its grip. But Raymond noticed subtle changes that others might miss. The angle of sunlight shifting slightly, the behavior of the few birds that remained, the quality of the snow becoming denser, wetter. Winter would break eventually. It had to, and when it did, Raymond would face a decision he'd been avoiding. What came next? Some nights, lying in his hollow oak with the fire crackling outside and deer hide wrapped around him, Raymond imagined walking back to the farmhouse, knocking on the door, seeing Martha's face. Would she even recognize him? Would she care that he'd survived? Part of him wanted to show her what he'd accomplished, to prove something he couldn't quite articulate. But a larger part of him had moved beyond that need. He'd proven what needed proving, if only to himself. The last week of March brought the first genuine thaw. Temperatures climbed into the 40s, and the snow began its slow retreat. Raymond emerged into a world coming back to life. Water dripping from every surface, the first brave birds returning, the forest floor gradually revealing itself. He'd made it. Against odds that should have killed him a dozen times over, he'd survived America's worst winter with nothing but a knife, knowledge, and an unbreakable will. On the first day of April, Raymond Blackwell walked out of the wilderness. Not defeated, not broken, but transformed. He walked the 7 miles to Millbrook, his deer hide coat drawing stares from everyone he passed, and made his way to the sheriff's office. The deputy on duty didn't recognize the wild-looking old man at first, then nearly fell out of his chair when Raymond gave his name. They'd assumed he was dead, frozen somewhere or taken by animals. Raymond never went back to Martha. He never needed to. His sister in Ohio took him in, and he spent his remaining years telling stories of that winter to grandchildren who listened with wide eyes. He died at 83 peacefully in his sleep, but those who knew him said he'd really died at 75 and been reborn inside a hollow tree as something tougher than winter itself.